Nitrile powder absorbs through a compromised glove in approximately 4 seconds. Waverly Oakes had learned that in a simulation lab in her second year of nursing school, in a room that smelled of antiseptic and the particular anxiety that only exists before practical exams. She thought about it standing in the grand ballroom of Vancouver's Fairmont Pacific Rim, watching a man in a $12,000 tuxedo begin to die, while 400 people clinked champagne glasses around him and noticed nothing. She was supposed to be furniture tonight. The on-site medical standby at galas like this one was a necessary fiction. A box ticked on the event's insurance waiver, a body posted near the service corridor with a medical bag and a lanyard, present for the fainting socialite, the executive with gout flared from too much rich food, the occasional alcohol-related incident. The catering company that contracted her paid $42 an hour, which was more than the hospital auxiliary rate, and enough to justify trading a Friday nighty observation shift for an evening of standing quietly against walls and being completely thoroughly invisible to everyone who mattered in the room. She was good at invisible, she had practice. But she had noticed Senator Colin Aldridge's left hand. 40 minutes ago, he had arrived with the ease of a man who had spent 20 years making every room feel like it was assembled in his honor. He was the kind of politician who wore conviction the way other men wore good suits, effortlessly, until you noticed it was a performance. He had worked the room with the precision of someone who understood that fundraisers of this caliber weren't about the charity. The room held 4 cabinet ministers, the CEO of a natural resources conglomerate, the president of the Port of Vancouver board, and the people those people needed to stay in favor with. Senator Aldridge understood that geography implicitly. He moved through it like he owned the coordinates. Now his left hand was trembling against a champagne flute he was no longer drinking from. Waverly had spent 8 months on a neurology ward at Vancouver General. She knew what involuntary fasciculation looked like. She knew the clinical presentation of early organophosphate toxicity from a toxicology rotation in her 3rd year. Mycosis, slight, but visible at 12 feet if you knew what you were looking for. Unequal pupils, excessive salivation, masked by the fact that he kept touching his mouth with a cocktail napkin as though he'd simply eaten something unpleasant. Subtle left-side hand tremor consistent with early neuromuscular disruption. He had ordered the oysters 38 minutes ago. She had been standing close enough to the service corridor to see it. Waverly pressed her back against the wall near the draped partition and ran the calculations with the cold, precise efficiency she'd developed from 2 years of pharmaceutical records auditing at a compounding pharmacy in Burnaby. If she was right about the compound, the exposure window was either pre-arrival or in the first course. He was on a medication. She'd overheard him mention beta blockers to a colleague during the cocktail hour, the way people on long-term prescriptions sometimes did without thinking, and the interaction window narrowed accordingly. 90 minutes. Less if the dose was calibrated with the interaction accounted for. Whoever had done this knew his medical history. The thought sat in her chest like a stone. If she went to the event coordinator, there would be protocol delays and the kind of institutional hesitations that cost minutes when minutes were what mattered. If she called 911 directly, the first responders would arrive to a man who was ambulatory and verbally coherent, which meant the window for visible evidence closed before intervention could be justified. There was also the matter of whoever had done this, still in the room, likely, watching the clock. Or, she looked across the ballroom. The roped-off section near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Burnaby Inlet was not listed on the event's seating chart. Waverly had checked during the setup, partly out of professional habit and partly because she'd known for 3 weeks that Casimir Locke was on the VIP roster, and she had spent 3 weeks rehearsing a version of this night that was considerably simpler than the one unfolding in front of her. Casimir Locke. She had found very little about him online, and what little she'd found had the quality of information that had been carefully curated rather than naturally sparse. public record. Hargrove Meridian, a pharmaceutical distribution company based in Vancouver with operations across Western Canada and an audited financial history that looked, on its surface, as clean as anything she'd seen in her records work. Charitable contributions, board memberships. A photograph from 3 years ago at a children's hospital benefit. Ironically, the same charity this evening was meant to support, in which he appeared at the edge of the frame, as though someone else had been photographed and he happened to be nearby. Private record, the kind of knowledge that moved through whisper networks and never committed to anything writable. The name attached to decisions that altered the economic geography of entire city blocks. The man whose organization, according to the specific and extremely guarded channels Waverly had exhausted in the last 3 weeks, ran the lending arm that had sent 2 men to her brother Ronan's apartment on a Tuesday night and left with his laptop, his passport, and a message she did not want to repeat to herself a 4th time. Ronan was 23. He was brilliant in the specific way of people who are very good at understanding systems and very bad at understanding consequences. He had borrowed $80,000 from Northgate Capital, a name that had taken her considerable effort to trace back through a chain of numbered companies to a holding entity within Hargrove Meridian's shadow structure, to finance a logistics tech startup that had closed in 7 months. The repayment deadline had been Monday. The men who came Tuesday were the afterword. Waverly had spent 72 hours doing everything that was supposed to help. Lawyers who did not return calls from people who sounded like her, a bank that offered her a pamphlet and sympathy in equal measure. She had pawned the cello she had played since she was 9 years old and raised $11,000, which was not $80,000, and was not a solution. And so she had come here, to this ballroom, with a plan that was either the most rational thing she'd ever done, or the clearest sign that she had passed beyond the territory where rational and desperate could be meaningfully distinguished. The plan: approach Casimir Locke under the professional cover of a routine wellness check, a blood pressure cuff, a lanyard, the unremarkable authority of medical personnel at events. 60 seconds. Ask for her brother's life in exchange for what she knew she could offer. The plan was simple and terrifying, and had not until this moment included a senator being poisoned in the same room. She looked at Senator Aldridge. She looked at the roped-off corner. Casimir Locke sat with the stillness of a man for whom stillness was a decision. Dark suit, no tie, one silver cufflink catching the chandelier light with a quiet precision that seemed almost deliberate. He had not touched the champagne. He had not mingled. He had not, from what Waverly could observe, said more than 8 words to anyone in the past 40 minutes. His eyes moved across the room with the same low, unhurried attention she recognized from senior physicians on a unit. Not looking at anything, looking at everything. Cataloguing the room's state of health. 4 men were positioned around the roped section in a configuration that was casual in the way that military things are sometimes dressed as civilian. Waverly picked up her medical bag. She told herself it was for Ronan. She also told herself, with an honesty she didn't have time for, that there was no version of herself that could stand against that service corridor wall and watch a man die while she did nothing. She crossed the ballroom floor in 12 steps. The nearest guard moved before she reached the rope. On-site medical standby, Waverly said quietly, holding up her lanyard and the blood pressure cuff simultaneously, the universal signifier of medical personnel who have somewhere to be. I need 2 minutes with Mr. Locke. Wellness check. She paused. Please tell him it concerns Senator Aldridge. The guard did not move. He turned his head by perhaps 10 degrees. Then, from the corner, the low and particular weight of a voice she hadn't heard yet. Let her through. She walked to Casimir Locke. He looked at her without expression, which was somehow more unsettling than any expression would have been. The attention was complete. The lanyard, the bag, the cuff, the cheap blazer she'd ironed that morning, her face. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. It felt considerably longer. Senator Aldridge, Waverly kept her voice low and level and did not allow herself to blink excessively. He's presenting with organophosphate toxicity indicators, meiosis, unequal pupils, left side fasciculation. He consumed the oysters during the first service pass, approximately 40 minutes ago. Given his documented beta blocker use, the cardiovascular interaction window is shorter than standard. He needs atropine and pralidoxime within the hour. She took a measured breath. He also needs to be removed from this room before those symptoms become visible to the broader crowd. You have the infrastructure to do that quietly. I have the medication in my kit. Another breath. I also have a personal matter I'd like to discuss with you. But the senator is the immediate concern. Casimir Locke did not look toward the senator. He continued looking at her. "Who are you?" he said, not inflected as a question exactly, more as a step in a longer process. "Waverly Oakes. Final year nursing student, contracted medical standby for tonight's event. I also worked pharmaceutical records for 4 years before school, compounding pharmacy in Burnaby, controlled substance auditing." She did not let herself look away. "My brother Ronan owes Northgate Capital $80,000. I know that's your organization. I know what happens Monday." Her hands were steady. She was proud of her hands. "The personal matter is that, but the senator first." A silence that had texture to it. "Why would I move the senator?" Casimir said, "rather than simply removing you from the premises?" "Because if Senator Aldridge dies at an event where you're present, the investigation that follows will look at everyone in this room, starting with the people they most want to look at. You're not difficult to find on that list." She paused. "He survives cleanly, the evening closes without incident, and you owe nothing to the mechanism of that outcome." She held up the cuff again. "I'm also the only person in this building who has already diagnosed him, and you don't have time to find another option." Something moved through Casimir Locke's expression. Brief, unreadable, gone before she could name it. He stood up. He was taller than she'd registered from across the room. Tall the way foundations are tall, not demonstrative, just structural. He said something low and quiet to the man on his left, who moved immediately in the direction of Senator Aldridge's cluster, with the fluid purposefulness of someone who had navigated complex social situations under considerably worse conditions. "Walk with me, Miss Oakes," Casimir said. They crossed the room at a pace that looked, to anyone watching, like nothing consequential. Waverly was aware of attention tracking them, the ambient calculation of a room accustomed to reading Casimir Locke's movements for information. She kept her eyes forward and her breathing calibrated and her medical bag close. He took her through a service door into a quiet, carpeted corridor that smelled of hotel laundry and catered food. The ballroom noise dropped to a murmur. 60 seconds, he said. Convince me the senator is genuinely at risk. Waverly set her bag on the floor and opened it without discussion. Organophosphate compounds inhibit acetylcholinesterase. Onset in a healthy adult is 90 to 120 minutes. In someone on beta blockers, the cardiovascular interaction accelerates that to 60 or 70 minutes from exposure. He's at 38 minutes. She looked up from the kit. The dose in his system is calibrated. It is not a random contamination. Someone measured this for a specific body weight and medication load. She placed the atropine vials on the carpet between them. Whoever did this knew his medical history. Casimir Locke crouched, not to bring himself to her level, she realized, but to look at the vials. He knew what they were. You carry atropine to catering events, he said. I've been through toxicology placements. I carry a kit appropriate to my clinical context. She met his eyes. The senator's clinical context has changed. He rose. What do you want for your brother? Time to repay the debt. A structured agreement. I'll work off the balance. Pharmaceutical records auditing. Distribution ledger analysis. Hargrove Meridian has regulatory filings across 4 provinces. I know what irregularities look like, and I know what they look like when they've been corrected. She paused. Ronan made a bad decision. He's 23. He doesn't deserve to pay for it permanently. Casimir looked at her for a moment that felt like a financial assessment. "Get the senator stable," he said. "We talk after." He assigned 2 of his men to walk Senator Aldridge to a private suite on the 14th floor, under the reasonable fiction of a private meeting. Waverly administered the atropine protocol in a room that smelled of fresh hotel linen and the particular quiet of spaces recently serviced and not yet inhabited. The senator, once he understood he was receiving legitimate medical care for something real, asked no questions and generated no complications, which she had not expected from a senator. By the time she repacked her kit, his color had returned and his pupils had equalized, and he was sitting up against the headboard, asking in a hoarse voice whether any of this needed to reach his office. "That," Casimir said from the doorway, "is not my decision to make." He looked at Waverly. She nodded once. The senator's aide took over. In the hallway, Casimir stopped and turned to face her. The corridor light was low and the sound from the ballroom below had faded to almost nothing. Senator Aldridge's food was switched at the service station. His voice was precisely uninflected. "The compound was in the oysters designated for my plate." He reached across and took them during the introduction round. He paused. "The hit was intended for me." The hallway felt very quiet after that. "You didn't know that until now," Waverly said. "I suspected. Now I'm relatively certain." He looked at her with the careful attention of someone reconstructing an event in real time. "Someone in my organization had access to contaminate a plate at a private event with a specifically calibrated pharmaceutical compound and sufficient knowledge of my dietary habits and seating assignment," which is a short list. The armored SUV was waiting in the hotel's private underground lot, which she hadn't known about and didn't ask about. The drive to a tower on West Georgia took 11 minutes. Waverly spent them looking at the lit-up grid of the downtown core and trying, with reasonable discipline, not to measure the distance between what she had planned for this evening and where she currently was. The private residence occupied the building's top 2 floors. Registered under a numbered company, she noted on the elevator panel. Inside, function over aesthetics, in the way of someone who had decided long ago what mattered and had stopped performing the rest. A bank of monitors running encrypted displays, a wall of windows above the city. The smell of coffee and something faintly chemical she couldn't immediately place. Emery Strand was already there. He was compact and quick-eyed, Casimir's second in command, with the kind of polished composure that sat just slightly too tightly to be entirely natural. He glanced at Waverly with an expression that performed neutrality and didn't quite achieve it. "She shouldn't be here," he said to Casimir. "She's the reason I'm still here," Casimir replied without ceremony, and she identified the senator's presentation before anyone else in the building did. He moved to the monitors. "Pull up the Hargrove distribution authorizations. The last 6 months." Strand pulled them up. Waverly moved closer to the screens without quite deciding to. She recognized the filing format immediately. The National Controlled Substance Authorization Framework. The same system she'd audited in Burnaby for 3 years. Column headers. Authorization codes. Distribution destination identifiers. Her eyes moved through the data the way they always did, not searching for anything specific, looking for the thing that didn't fit the rhythm of the rest. She found it in the column 7 authorizations dated 6 weeks back. "Mr. Locke," she kept her voice steady. "Sodium fluoroacetate precursor compound, authorized out of your Vancouver distribution facility." She leaned toward the screen slightly. "The authorization signatory code belongs to Strand Logistics. That's a personal holding company registered to Emery Strand." She moved to the adjacent column. "The destination entry is a private laboratory address in Coquitlam. The compound doesn't appear on any approved pharmaceutical formulation list in the active filing system. It is, however, a base component for the class of organophosphate used on Senator Aldridge tonight." She turned around. Strand's face had taken on the particular gray of a man, watching an outcome arrive faster than he had calculated. "She's drawing inferences," Strand said. His voice was controlled in the way of something being held at pressure. She doesn't have context for that authorization. It's a legacy entry from a dissolved research contract. The authorization is dated 6 weeks ago, Waverly said. There are no dissolved research contracts in your active filing system with that signatory and that compound class. And the date correlates precisely with the 3-week preparation window for tonight's event. She heard the shift before she saw it, the sound of fabric moving against a jacket lining, the change in the room's air pressure that preceded a decision. She took one step back. Casimir Locke moved before anything else happened. She had not seen him move quickly before that moment. She understood now why no one in that ballroom had come within 10 feet of him without an invitation. He covered the distance between himself and Strand in the time it took Waverly to register that he'd started, applied a single targeted pressure hold that dropped Strand to his knees and held him there with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned precisely this, in places with very few rules about restraint. "Emery," Casimir said. The name sounded like a room closing. "Tell me why." "The senator," Strand said through the compression of pain, "was pushing a financial crimes investigation. He had a source inside the organization. If Aldridge died cleanly, the investigation died with him. You would have been linked to it eventually. I was managing the liability before it reached you." "By trying to kill me," Casimir said. "By managing the liability," Strand repeated, with a precision that was almost impressively divorced from self-preservation instinct. Casimir looked at him for a long time. Then he said simply and quietly, "You chose the wrong week to manage anything without telling me." Waverly turned to the window. She placed her palm flat against the cold glass and looked at the city below. 4 million lit-up lives that would wake up tomorrow, knowing nothing about this room this evening. The 42 minutes between a poisoned plate and a corridor conversation that had altered the entire shape of her life. She thought about Ronan. She thought about the $11,000 from the cello. She thought about standing in the ballroom in her polyester blazer being invisible. And how invisible had turned out to be the last thing she actually was. She breathed through what she heard behind her, the way she'd learned to breathe through difficult things, measured, deliberate, forward-facing. After a silence that felt geological, footsteps stopped a few feet away from her. "Ronan's debt is cleared," Casimir Locke said, "as of tonight." Waverly closed her eyes briefly. The glass was very cold against her palm. "The Strand authorization trail," he continued, "needs to be authenticated through the right channels and then handled with precision. The distribution records beyond tonight have irregularities that will need to be identified and corrected carefully by someone who understands what they're reading and why it matters." He paused. "You found the core discrepancy in under 4 minutes, in a record system you've never accessed, in the middle of what has been, by most reasonable measures, an unusual evening." She turned around. He was standing at the center of the room, jacket open, the monitors glowing behind him. He looked, for the first time since she'd met him, like someone who had survived the night, rather than someone who was managing it. "What do you want from me?" she asked. It was the same question she had asked of every legitimate institution she'd tried in the past 3 days. None of them had offered anything worth hearing. "Someone who reads pharmaceutical records the way other people read plain language," Casimir said. "Someone who cannot be outbid, because they understand precisely what they're looking at and what it costs if it's wrong." He looked at her steadily. "And someone who walked into a room she had no business entering, identified a medical emergency, negotiated for her brother's life, and then sat down in a stranger's penthouse and found the evidence that would have destroyed me, all within the same evening, without once losing the thread of what she came to do." Waverly looked at the monitors, at the city below the windows, at the quiet space in the room she was deliberately not examining. "I have 8 months of nursing school left," she said. "I know. You'll complete them." He said it the way he said most things, not commanding, simply describing the shape of what was going to happen. "After that, You'll have a nursing registration, a specialization in pharmaceutical analysis, and if tonight is any indication, the ability to walk into the most dangerous room you've ever seen and remain functional. Those qualifications are not common." She stood in the quiet for a moment. She thought about what she was being offered, and what she was being asked to become, and whether those were the same thing or different things, and whether the distinction mattered, given the coordinates of where she was already standing. She had made the real decision when she'd crossed the rope line in the ballroom. She understood that now. Every step after that had simply been the consequence of who she already was, who she had always been, in rooms where no one thought to look at her. She placed her medical bag on Casimir Locke's desk. "Show me the rest of the records," Waverly Oakes said. She pulled out the chair, sat down, and the glow of the monitors caught her face, and the city burned quietly below, and she did not look away from the screen.